Hi guys, thanks for watching our in-service. Today we're going to talk about protecting our residents from abuse, neglect, misappropriation, exploitation, involuntary seclusion, and some other things. So ideally, I kind of designed this in-service to be one where a group of people could actively discuss it. And because we're watching a video, it's going to be harder to obviously have an active discussion. So I still want you guys, and if you're watching with a group, please feel free to discuss. But I want you guys to really think about the scenarios that I'm going to pull up for you and what questions you might ask, what questions you might want to know the answers to, whether or not this stuff is abuse. And I really want you to think about what this looks like in reality as we go through some of this stuff. And so the first thing that I really want you to do is think about what abuse looks like. What does that mean? And there's really no right or wrong answers. There are some definitions that we're going to go through to cement what we're talking about when we talk about abuse in the nursing home. But just kind of picture it in your head, get an idea in your head about what this means. And we're going to go through the scenarios, and for each scenario, I want you to formalize an opinion on whether the scenario is actually talking about an abuse situation. I don't think every scenario in here is talking about an abuse situation, but every scenario that we're going to go through has some questionable circumstances, and I would like us to at least process and think about what we would want to know before we determined if that is abusive or not. And then if you come to the conclusion that something is abuse, how would you intervene? So think about that. What questions would you like to ask? Who would you ask those questions to? And would you feel the need to report this to law enforcement? And we're going to talk a little bit more towards the end of this presentation about law enforcement and about reporting abuse and who we're responsible for reporting abuse to and who is responsible for reporting abuse. So scenario one, and again, these scenarios, I have several, and I just want you guys to think about these as we go through them before we get to the content of the policy. So Mr. Kennedy has dementia and sometimes gets upset and anxious in the evening. He lives in a nursing home where staff are under a lot of pressure to get everything done for everyone on the floor. He will often follow the staff around, asking them to take him home and asking them to sit with him. The nurse gives him Benadryl to calm him down so the staff can tend to everyone else. A second scenario. A 75-year-old man with pulmonary fibrosis is admitted for pneumonia. As you are going towards his room to give him his medications, you hear his partner in the room say in a nasty tone of voice, "Stop being so stubborn. I need you to give me access to your bank accounts. You're going to die alone unless you start cooperating." As you enter the room, the man leaves quickly and you notice that the patient has tears in his eyes. You ask if everything is okay and the patient shakes his head yes but doesn't say anything. After administering the medication, you leave, but the exchange between them keeps replaying in your head. Mr. McGinnis, 79 years old, has been living in a nursing home for the past 5 years. He was a coal miner until the mine closed. He has emphysema and needs oxygen on a regular basis. His daughter, Joan, visits him weekly. This week, Mr. McGinnis told his daughter that Sally, the night shift person, is very mean to him. He said that Sally yells at him if he asks for help to get to the washroom at night. Mr. McGinnis told his daughter he's afraid to go to the washroom alone because he has to take the oxygen tank with him. He doesn't feel stable enough to get himself and the oxygen tank to the washroom without a fall. Joan asked him if he has talked to the supervisor about Sally. He said he hasn't because he knows Sally is a single mother and needs this job to support her 2 small children. He says that he and Sally used to be very friendly, but that things have changed over the past few months. He's afraid that if he says something, that Sally might lose her job, or even worse, that things might get worse instead of better for him. He also told Joan that he is now having trouble sleeping. Joan is worried and not sure what to do. So again, think about those questions. Initially, is this, as it reads here, is this abuse without any further investigation? Does this look like abuse? What kind of abuse is this? And what should be done about this situation? Okay, Miss Scott lives in a nursing home. She looks forward to getting her baths every Thursday evening. Thursday evening rolls around and she has a new CNA working with her. She asks the new CNA what time she's going to get her bath. The new CNA says that she's not yet been trained on the equipment and cannot do her bath. So Miss Scott does not get her bath on Thursday and has to wait for someone else to do it on a different day. And we'll go through some definitions again as we go through this presentation on abuse, neglect, and misappropriation, on exactly what is neglect. So certainly we would look at a situation like this and be like, well, it's, she should get her bath. Is this neglect? Is this not neglect? Is it neglect if the CNA lied and she has actually been trained on the equipment? Or is it neglect if the CNAs just got really busy and prioritized other care over baths? So all things to think about. Jane is a widow who's still very active in her nursing home and assisted living community. She often takes part in social dinners and cards with the local seniors group. Since her husband died, Billy, 74 years old, has given her a lot of attention. He often asks her to attend the events with him and sit with him. Jane misses the companionship of a man and enjoys the friendship, but feels Billy is coming on too strong. At the last dinner dance, Billy grabbed Jane's bottom and made a lewd comment. Jane was shocked and told him to leave her alone. Sandy, Jane's friend, was standing right beside her when Billy grabbed her bottom. Sandy told Jane she was overreacting and that Billy didn't mean any harm. He was just having a good time. Jane left the activity. She now feels embarrassed and doesn't want to attend any more activities if Sandy or Billy will be there. Oh, what kind of abuse? What do we need to know more of, and what do we need to do? Okay, a resident of a nursing home who has been becoming more confused lately has been pushing her call light more frequently. When staff come to answer her call light, oftentimes she has forgotten what she needed. The resident pushed her call light, and a staff member came into the room, put the call light in the resident's drawer, and closed it, preventing the resident from requesting staff assistance. And this is my last one. A staff member is calling a friend using a video calling feature while on shift. The staff member enters a resident's room while using the video calling feature and sees the resident undressed and exposed in bed. The staff member using video calling quickly exits the room, and the caller on the other end did not see the resident. However, the next day the resident reports to the DON that they felt very violated because someone who is not their caregiver may have seen them undressed. So again, think about those scenarios and what we, as we go through this content, we'll kind of review some scenarios again and look at what questions we might ask or what we would do about the situations. So abuse is defined as the willful infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or punishment with resulting physical harm, pain, or mental anguish. And that word willful is important here because that's one of the words that really defines the term, is that someone's action has to be willful to engage in abuse. And there's different kinds of abuse. So we're going to look at verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, and basically a staff member in a position of authority really, when taking care of these vulnerable people, cannot engage in anything that causes distress, mental anguish, physical pain, or mental pain. So Neglect is defined as the failure of the facility, its employees, or service providers to provide goods and services to a resident that are necessary to avoid physical harm, pain, mental anguish, or emotional distress. So it's an intentional omission or intentional course of conduct by a caregiver or a non-client resident, including but not limited to restraint, isolation, or confinement that is contrary to the entity's policies and procedures, is not part of the client's treatment plan, and through substantial carelessness or negligence does any of the following: could cause pain, disregards the client's rights, or could be reasonably expected to cause mental or emotional damage. So kind of think about our scenario that we went through with the bath. Does a caregiver who's not trained on equipment intentionally neglect a resident by not doing a bath? No. Does a caregiver who neglects to do the bath because they just don't want to, potentially engaging in neglectful behavior? And yes, certainly. So a scenario, this is probably the most common form of abuse in nursing homes, is neglect. And so we have to be very mindful of what that looks like in real life instead of just the definitions of the words. Exploitation is another form of abuse defined as taking advantage of a resident for personal gain through the use of manipulation, intimidation, threats, or coercion. Misappropriation is theft, basically. Deliberate misplacement, exploitation, or wrongful temporary or permanent use of a resident's belongings or money without consent. And then injury of unknown source, we call those injuries of unknown origin a lot here. An injury is an injury of unknown source when it meets both of these criteria and requires investigation. The injury was not observed and the source cannot be explained by the resident, and the injury is suspicious because of the extent of it, the location of it, or the frequency or number of injuries observed in a short period of time. So we have a very inclusive, a lengthy resident abuse policy, and there are several components to that abuse policy. All of these components are used in the prevention of abuse and neglect of our residents, and we'll review each of these components individually. So this is an update to the previous education on abuse that we had done, where there were 7 components, and now the additional 8th component is that coordination with the Quality Assurance and Performance Improvement Program. So let's go through each one of these briefly. So we do screening. We do screening of residents, we do screening of employees before they come into the facility. Employees go through a screening process before being hired, including a caregiver background check, an OIG check, criminal background check, reference checks, and residents go through a screening process as well, because abuse can be carried out by anyone in the facility, not just employees, not just volunteers, not just contractors, but residents as well. Resident-to-resident altercations are also potentially considered abuse. We go through abuse training. So staff, contracted employees, contractors, volunteers, everyone gets education about abuse, neglect, and misappropriation, which is why everyone's going to be required to watch this video. Then we have the prevention component. So largely, after screening, after education, we want to create an environment where residents can report concerns, and family members and staff report incidents, report grievances, and that we can respond back to the residents and the families about these concerns and complaints, and assess the needs of the residents to make sure that we are capable of providing care to those residents to prevent any potential for abuse or neglect. We need to be able to identify symptoms and potential signs of abuse and neglect. Occurrences, patterns, and trends that may constitute abuse will be investigated. So we need to identify those changes in condition, report if residents' behavior is different, report bruises, report trouble sleeping, changes in sleeping patterns, changes in eating patterns. If a resident has a complaint or is suddenly very fearful of a staff member or a visitor or even a family member, we need to investigate those things so that they can be adequately intervened on and reported if necessary. Investigation is another component of our abuse policy. So every allegation of abuse requires an investigation. We need to do a thorough investigation to determine whether or not abuse occurred. If the occurrence or the allegation doesn't rise to the level of abuse, we still need to do a root cause analysis to the problem that occurred, do an analysis, see what we can do differently to address those circumstances, and make sure that we come to a reasonable conclusion about what happened. We want to prevent, the investigation process is to identify problems and to prevent those problems from occurring in the future. And then, of course, protection. Our whole goal of resident protection is to protect the resident. So immediately upon receiving a report of alleged abuse, the nursing home administrator or designee, so that could be like me or someone else that's designated to be in charge of the facility at any given time, will coordinate the delivery of appropriate medical and or psychological care and attention. So nurses especially should know as soon as abuse is reported to you, you need to notify the nursing home administrator of that, but also prior to even reporting to the nursing home administrator, you need to stop the abuse from happening and start performing any physical assessments that are required to make sure that the residents receives appropriate attention. And then allegations involving abuse, neglect, exploitation, or general mistreatment, including injuries of unknown source that cannot be easily explained, have to be reported to the state agency. If there's serious bodily injury, that's 2 hours time limit for reporting. If it's not a serious bodily injury, we need to report within 24 hours. And all suspicions of a crime have to be reported to local law enforcement. So elder abuse is a crime, and the responsibility of reporting that crime, so normally through an investigation, I report those suspicions to local law enforcement. However, any staff member with knowledge of the incident is responsible for making sure that that crime is reported. So yes, if you report it to me, I can certainly talk about it. We'll talk about it. I'll tell you, yes, I'm reporting this to the state. Yes, I'm reporting this to local law enforcement. But just there is a responsibility that if you suspect a crime, you have to know that it's getting reported. And if you don't feel confident that that's happening, you are responsible for reporting that kind of thing as well. So Moral Home Nursing and Rehab has to work pretty closely with local law enforcement in determining what would not be reported. So basically, anytime an allegation of abuse is made, whether it be a resident-to-resident altercation, a staff-to-resident altercation, I at minimum call local law enforcement. I run it through dispatch and an officer calls me back. And I go through the scenario with them, whatever I found out in my investigation of the time, and they tell me whether or not they're going to take action on that report. But we have to talk. We have to talk through all of those things and make sure that all of that stuff is reported and that local law enforcement is aware, because elder abuse especially is just so, it's not just underreported, but it's very undertreated, and there's been a history of this kind of abuse being very neglected by everyone, by law enforcement, by state agencies, by individuals, by family members. Residents certainly probably don't report abuse the way that we would want them to report it and come to us. So basically, we report everything because we want the seriousness of taking care of our elders to be our primary focus, and their care and their safety is our priority. So sometimes I kind of have this bullet point in here. It doesn't necessarily go right here as far as the policy is concerned, but it was a side note that I wanted to make sure that people are aware of. And one of the criteria for determining whether abuse occurred is to determine the response of the resident. Is the resident very upset by this issue? Did it cause physical pain? Did it cause mental anguish? And sometimes it's really hard to determine whether those things occurred. So what we have to do is put ourselves in the position of a reasonable person. So let's say the person who was the victim in the allegation has significant dementia, and 3 minutes after this allegation or this event occurred, the resident has no idea what happened. They don't remember it. So rather than saying there's obviously no mental anguish because they do not remember, we need to look at if someone was able to remember and that allegation or that event or incident happened to them, would a reasonable person have mental anguish or be upset by that situation? And so that's a criteria also that we have to think about in this setting of determining whether or not abuse occurred. And then the last component, coordination with QAPI, is the Quality Assurance and Performance Improvement program. We will review all allegations and investigations of abuse, neglect, misappropriation, exploitation, and injuries of unknown source, and we'll do some root cause analysis, determine if we have to do re-education, change something about our abuse and neglect policies, change something about the way we do educations or investigations, and ensure that all of our reporting was done appropriately. So then just kind of go through these scenarios again with the information that we just went through. You can read the scenario quickly. We're not going to be able to discuss each of these scenarios, obviously, because I'm talking to myself, but just kind of think about, with what you learned and what you know and what some of the definitions are, whether or not these scenarios rise to the level of abuse. So something that I would especially want to know about scenario number 1 is whether or not the Benadryl that the nurse gave to the patient was a physician's order, and whether or not the Benadryl given to the patient was used with the correct indication. So just because a resident has an order for Benadryl, and we know Benadryl has some sedating properties, if a resident has an order for Benadryl because they have a shellfish allergy, and instead of giving it to them for the indication of them having a reaction to shellfish, we give it to them to knock them out so they stop bothering us, that would be abuse. Misuse of medication. It would also be practicing outside of the scope of a nurse's license. Scenario 2. So like I said before, anyone can be a perpetrator of resident abuse. So it's not just a staff member, it's not just a visitor, it's not just a contractor, it's not just a doctor that's coming in, it's family members too, and we overlook that sometimes. So regardless of who is involved in the situation, if you're concerned about something that's happening or an interaction that a family member or someone has with a resident, make sure that you report it so that we can do an appropriate investigation and protect that resident, because residents, no matter what, if we're going to protect them if they're in our facility, and sometimes that could potentially even be from their own family. So with this scenario, I would definitely want to talk to the night staff involved. We would want to talk to the nurses involved. We'd want to talk to other residents to see if the same thing was occurring. We'd want to look at Mr. McInnes's overall situation, get his reports. There's a lot here. All of this is very concerning. You would definitely want to do a complete and thorough investigation and report this. This is definitely verbal abuse, and it also could look like neglect, certainly. So talked about this a little bit as we went through. Is this abuse in and of itself? Not necessarily. But we need to ask questions, we need to know more information. What does our training look like? If we're not training our people appropriately or our staff appropriately, then we're not appropriately taking care of our residents. We'll need to do retraining. If we investigate this and find out that the staff member had actually been trained on the equipment and just didn't like Miss Scott or just didn't want to do this task, we would start to consider the possibility that this is neglect. So definitely feel a little bad for Jane here. There's certainly a resident-to-resident altercation, and it was a witnessed resident-to-resident altercation by another witness. So definitely looks like sexual abuse to me. Definitely looks like something that caused some mental anguish. Jane doesn't want to go to any more activities. And what are we going to do about it? And that's part of the investigative process, and drawing reasonable conclusions and then putting interventions in place to protect, for the protection portion of the components of our abuse policy. This one was written, I thought, a little bit, I kind of stole these. This one was written, I thought, a little bit more clear-cut. Definitely looking at involuntary seclusion. In this case, you cannot deprive a staff member of asking you cannot deprive a resident of asking for a staff member's assistance. You cannot seclude them. You cannot prevent them from being heard. This is definitely an abuse situation that would require investigation as to the scope of this. How often is this happening? Is this happening to other residents? That sort of thing. And the video calling feature. So not only are we looking at concerns about HIPAA and exposure and abuse, exposure of vulnerable people, we're looking at likely some pretty significant policy violations and derelictions of duty. So if we investigated this and were able to determine that the caller on the other end of the line didn't actually see the resident, that HIPAA wasn't actually violated, that technically abuse didn't occur, we'd still have a lot of very significant concerns about the resident's feelings and about that behavior, which is why we say don't take pictures of residents, don't post pictures on social media, don't use your phone in resident care areas. It could very quickly rise to the level of needing to be reported to the state and local law enforcement. So, questions. We'll go through these real quick. Every staff member is responsible for intervening and protecting the resident if they see or suspect abuse is occurring, and that is true. Every single person. Nursing, CNAs, housekeeping, laundry, everybody is responsible for intervening and protecting residents. Who is required to report to local law enforcement if there is a suspicion of a crime? And no, not only the NHA or the DON, it's anyone with knowledge of the event. If a staff member has the education and knowledge to perform resident care and intentionally refuses to do so, and intentionally is a key word here because they do not like the task, this is an example of what kind of abuse, and that is neglect. What does QAPI stand for? This one was hard. I had to come up with a lot of keywords, and there is not a lot of keywords going on here. So, quality assurance and performance improvement. not quietly adjusting to professional inquiries or question all professional institutions. A resident cannot abuse another resident. Is that true or false? And that is certainly false. Resident-to-resident altercations are investigated and reported as potential allegations of abuse. A staff member who hides a resident's call light so the resident cannot ask for help to leave their room has engaged in what type of abuse? And that is certainly involuntary seclusion. And later, to an extent, could also be incorporating neglect into there as well. A staff member slaps a resident who is anxious and repeating the same questions over and over again, but the resident has dementia and doesn't remember 5 minutes later, so abuse has not occurred. Obviously false. Even if the resident doesn't remember, a reasonable person who did remember would not appreciate being slapped, and a crime has certainly occurred in this situation. If I have a suspicion that a resident is being abused or neglected right now, I should not do nothing, not talk to your mom about it later, stop the abuse, protect the resident, and report to the nursing home administrator or designee right away. So the designee would likely, in most cases, be myself, the director of nursing. If you have any questions about abuse, neglect, any of the things that we talked about today, I want you guys to ask questions, and I want you to ask questions from reputable sources. So I do want these situations and this education to create some discussion. I want you guys to be able to discuss the scenarios, especially, and discuss what you would do about those scenarios, discuss questions you would ask or concerns that you would have. I want all that to happen. I also want you to get all your information from reputable sources. So if you have questions about this policy, this education, this training, or just elder abuse in general, please come to myself, to the nursing home administrator, or to Emily B., our staff development infection control nurse. Thank you so much for watching. Please complete your quizzes and let me know if you need any other information. Thanks.